Red Hollow. Kentucky isn't the kind of place strangers usually settle into, which is why everyone noticed when Paul showed up during the autumn of 2017. At 28, I'd been running the local hardware store on Chestnut Avenue for about 5 years after taking it over from my father, and in a town where everybody knows everybody's business, a new face stands out like a neon sign in a cornfield. Paul was different from the usual drifters who passed through. He had this quiet, methodical way about him, always wearing the same faded denim jacket with copper buttons that caught the light in odd ways. He rented the old Garrison building near the town square, the one that had been sitting empty since the antique shop closed down, and within a week he'd hung up a hand-painted sign that read, "Radio Repair, all makes, all ages," in neat, precise lettering that seemed almost too perfect to be done by hand. The thing about Red Hollow is that we still loved our radios, old habits from when the town was more isolated, before reliable internet reached every corner of the county. Most families had at least one vintage radio gathering dust in their attics, inherited from grandparents who used to huddle around them for evening programs back when Roosevelt was president. Paul's timing couldn't have been better, really, because there'd been this wave of nostalgia hitting the older folks, wanting to hear those old tubes warm up again, wanting to share that crackling magic with their grandchildren. Within his first month, half the town had dropped off their broken radios at his shop, and the remarkable thing was that Paul never turned anyone away, never said a radio was too far gone or beyond repair. He'd just nod, write your name on a yellow tag with that same precise handwriting, tie it to the radio's cord, and tell you to come back in exactly 3 days. Never 2, never 4, always exactly 3 days. The first radio I brought him belonged to my grandmother, a 1952 Zenith with a mahogany case that hadn't worked since I was in middle school. Paul ran his fingers along the wooden grain like he was reading Braille, then opened the back panel without even looking for the screws, his hands just knowing where everything was supposed to be. He pulled out components I couldn't name, examined them against the window light, and made these small humming sounds, not quite a tune, but more like he was having a conversation with the machine itself. 3 days later, when I picked it up, that radio didn't just work. It played clearer than it ever had, picking up stations from Louisville, Nashville, even Chicago on clear nights, when before it could barely catch the local AM station from 2 towns over. Paul charged me $30, which seemed almost insulting for the miracle he'd performed. But when I tried to tip him extra, he pushed the money back across the counter with his fingertips, like touching it too long might burn him. By November, Paul had become something of a local celebrity, though celebrity might be too strong a word for someone who rarely spoke above a whisper and never attended any town functions. People would see him at Nora's Diner every morning at exactly 6:15, sitting in the corner booth with black coffee and wheat toast, reading newspapers from cities none of us had ever visited: Detroit, Philadelphia, Seattle. Always from dates 3 weeks old, which Nora special ordered for him, though she never said why. His workshop lights stayed on until 2 or 3 in the morning, and if you walked past late enough, you could hear the sound of multiple radios playing simultaneously, creating this weird symphony of overlapping voices and static that made your teeth ache if you listened too long. But the strangest thing, the detail that should have warned us all, was that Paul never owned a radio himself, at least not one that anyone ever saw him use or carry, despite spending every waking hour surrounded by them. The first real sign of trouble came through Beverly Hutchinson's kitchen radio, a cream-colored Motorola from 1964 that Paul had repaired just before Thanksgiving. Beverly called me at the hardware store on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice shaking like autumn leaves, asking if I could come over right away and bring my grandmother's radio with me. When I got to her house on Sycamore Road, she was sitting at her kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of cold tea, staring at the Motorola like it might bite her. She told me to wait until exactly 4:30, then turn on both radios and listen. At 4:29, the regular country music station was playing some Hank Thompson song, but the moment the clock hit 4:30, the music dissolved into static, then cleared into a voice I didn't recognize. a man speaking in measured tones, describing how Beverly had buried her late husband's gambling debt notices in the backyard last spring, how she'd burned them one by one in a metal trash can at 3 in the morning, while crying so hard she could barely see the flames. Beverly and I sat there in stunned silence as the voice continued, describing details only she could have known. The pattern on the metal can, the way she'd worn her husband's old bathrobe over her nightgown, how she'd said a prayer for forgiveness after each document turned to ash. Then the voice shifted, and suddenly it was describing my morning routine from the previous day, how I'd stood in front of my bathroom mirror for 12 minutes debating whether to shave, how I'd eaten cereal straight from the box while reading yesterday's mail, how I'd called my ex-girlfriend's number just to hear her voicemail message before hanging up without leaving anything. The broadcast lasted exactly 7 minutes. Then both radios snapped back to the country station as if nothing had happened, right in the middle of Patsy Cline singing about falling to pieces. Beverly asked me to take her radio with me, said she never wanted to see it again, and when I picked it up I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Tiny scratches on the bottom that looked like initials, though not Beverly's initials or her husband's, but something that looked like a catalog number, BH047. Word spread through Red Hollow faster than wildfire in August, and by that evening, at least a dozen people had discovered their repaired radios were broadcasting similar invasive narratives at specific times throughout the day. George Whitman heard his radio describing the affair he'd had 20 years ago in Louisville, down to the name of the motel and the color of the bedsheets. The Carpenter twins' radio revealed where they'd been stealing copper wire from construction sites. And poor Nancy Dawson's old Philco announced to her entire bridge club that she'd been writing romance novels under a fake name and hiding the money in a separate bank account her husband didn't know about. Each broadcast lasted exactly 7 minutes, always at different times for different radios, and always containing information that the owners swore nobody else could possibly know. The hardware store became an impromptu meeting place that night, with people bringing their cursed radios wrapped in blankets and garbage bags. Some folks so spooked they'd removed the batteries and still claimed they could hear whispers coming from the speakers. Sheriff Garrett, a bear of a man who'd been keeping order in Red Hollow since before I was born, initially thought it was some kind of elaborate prank, maybe kids with broadcasting equipment trying to stir up trouble. But when his own repaired radio, a 1948 Crossley his father had left him, started describing how he'd falsified evidence in a drug case to protect his nephew, his whole demeanor changed. He organized a group to go to Paul's shop that very night, taking me along since I'd been the first to experience the broadcasts with Beverly. The workshop was dark when we arrived around 9:30, but the door was unlocked, which should have been our first warning that something was deeply wrong. Inside, the front room looked normal enough. Workbenches covered in radio parts, soldering irons neatly arranged, boxes of vacuum tubes sorted by size and type. But there was a smell underneath the motor oil and heated metal. Something organic and wrong, like overripe fruit mixed with copper pennies. And all of us noticed how the temperature dropped at least 10 degrees the moment we stepped through the doorway. Sheriff Garrett found the hidden door behind a filing cabinet, cleverly concealed but not impossible to spot once you knew something had to be there. The cabinet slid aside on hidden rails, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into what must have been a basement nobody knew existed. The Garrison building's original plans showed no lower level. The smell got stronger as we went down, and we could hear something mechanical running, a rhythmic clicking and whirring like an old film projector crossed with a typewriter. The room at the bottom was maybe 20 feet square, lit by dozens of small red bulbs that gave everything a darkroom quality, and every wall was lined floor to ceiling with recording equipment, reel-to-reel tape machines, professional microphone setups, and hundreds upon hundreds of cassette tapes in plastic cases. Each cassette was labeled with a name and date, and when Sheriff Garrett started reading them aloud, we realized they were all people from Red Hollow, some who'd moved away years ago, others who'd died, and at least 30 names none of us recognized at all. The centerpiece of the room was a massive wooden table, covered in what looked like surveillance equipment from different decades. Old telephone switchboard components, telegraph keys, primitive recording devices I'd only seen in museums, and modern digital recorders all wired together into some incomprehensible network. But what made us all stop breathing was the far wall, where Paul had created a map of Red Hollow using pushpins and colored thread, with photographs attached to various locations, photos taken through windows, showing people in their homes, in their most private moments. There was Beverly burning her husband's papers, George Whitman meeting his lover at a motel, Nancy Dawson typing at her secret computer, and dozens more, each photo time-stamped from years before Paul had supposedly arrived in town. Sheriff Garrett pulled down one photo of a young woman named Catherine Brennan, and written on the back in Paul's precise handwriting was, KBR 031, disappeared April 2008, recordings complete, awaiting broadcast window. Catherine Brennan had been reported as a runaway 9 years ago, just another troubled kid who'd left for the big city, except now we were staring at evidence that suggested something far worse. Sheriff Garrett immediately called for backup from the state police while the rest of us stood frozen in that red-lit room, afraid to touch anything else we might find. Behind another stack of equipment, Deputy Collins discovered a leather journal filled with pages of notes about radio frequencies and human consciousness, about how certain wavelengths could carry more than just sound, how they could preserve what Paul called essential narratives of a person's existence. The last entry, dated just that morning, simply read, "They know now, time to migrate the collection to Location C. Must preserve the archived voices before they understand the complete process." We found Paul 2 hours later at the bus station 3 towns over, sitting on a bench with a single suitcase that contained nothing but clothes and more cassette tapes. These ones labeled with names from other states, other towns we'd never heard of, going back nearly 40 years according to the dates. He didn't resist arrest, didn't say a word except to ask if we'd touch the equipment in the basement. And when Sheriff Garrett said yes, Paul's face went white as fresh paper, and he whispered something about containment protocols being broken. The state investigators spent 3 weeks in that basement, cataloging everything, and what they found still makes my chest tight when I think about it. The tapes weren't just recordings. They contained hours upon hours of people's most intimate moments, conversations they'd had alone in their cars, phone calls they thought were private, even what seemed to be recordings of their dreams based on the sleep-talking and unconscious murmurs. 37 names on those tapes matched missing persons cases from Kentucky, Tennessee, and Indiana, spanning 4 decades. And while they never found bodies, they found something else. A second room behind the basement wall containing personal effects from each missing person, carefully preserved and labeled with those same catalog numbers. Paul never admitted to killing anyone, insisted during every interrogation that he was just an archivist, a keeper of stories that would otherwise be lost. But he also never explained how he got those recordings, or why Catherine Brennan's purse was in that hidden room with her driver's license still inside. They sent him to a federal facility for psychiatric evaluation, and Red Hollow tried to forget, but even now, 5 years later, sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I swear I can still hear faint broadcasts coming through the walls. Voices I recognize describing moments that haven't happened yet, conversations that won't occur for days or weeks. And I wonder if Paul's equipment is still running somewhere, still recording, still waiting for the right frequency to tell everyone's secrets. The drive to Gladwin took me through miles of pine forests and forgotten highways, past rusted mailboxes and weathered barns that looked exactly like they did 35 years ago. My 42nd birthday had passed just last month, and returning to that house felt like walking backwards through time, each mile stripping away another year of carefully constructed distance. My family owned that property from 1989 to 1991, though nobody ever explained why we left so suddenly, why Dad took a pay cut to relocate us to Ohio, or why Mom would change the subject whenever I asked about our old place. The realtor had called me 3 weeks earlier. The current owners abandoned it, stopped paying taxes, and now it sat in foreclosure. Since my name was still on some old county records as a former resident, they wondered if I wanted first option to buy. I didn't want the house, but something pulled me back there. Some unfinished thread that had been tugging at me for decades. The property looked smaller than memory suggested, sitting on the wrong side of the railroad tracks that divided Gladwin between the respectable neighborhoods and places like ours. Paint peeled from the siding in long strips like dead skin, and the front porch sagged under the weight of neglect and Michigan winters. I parked my rental car beside a pile of rotting lumber someone had stacked against the garage 20 years ago, now home to possums and God knows what else. The key was under a fake rock near the steps, exactly where the realtor said it would be. Standing there with that cold metal in my palm, I remembered my younger sister Melody, how she used to clutch my arm when we walked up these same steps after school. She was 7 when we lived here, always talking about the thin man she saw at night, standing in the corner of our shared bedroom. Mom would smooth her hair, tell her it was just shadows from the streetlight, but Melody would shake her head so hard her pigtails would whip around, insisting he was real, that he watched us sleep. Inside, the house exhaled 30 years of dust and mildew, that particular smell of abandonment that gets into your throat and stays there. Faded wallpaper curled at the corners, revealing water stains that spread across the ceiling like diseased skin. I walked through the living room, my footsteps echoing on warped hardwood, remembering how Mom used to keep plastic covers on all the furniture, how Dad would sit in his recliner reading the paper, while pretending not to hear Melody crying upstairs about the thin man. The kitchen cabinets hung open, most of the doors missing, and someone had torn out the old avocado-colored appliances, leaving gaps like pulled teeth. But it was the hallway that made me pause, that narrow passage leading to the bedrooms where the air seemed thicker, heavier. The closet door at the end of the hall stood slightly ajar, the same closet Melody refused to go near, the one she said the thin man came from. I pushed open our old bedroom door, hinges screaming against the silence, and found myself staring at that corner where Melody claimed he stood. The room felt wrong, too small, like the walls had crept inward over the years. Afternoon light filtered through filthy windows, casting long shadows across the floor, and I understood how a 7-year-old might see monsters in those dark angles. But then I noticed something that made me stop breathing for a moment. Scratch marks on the closet door frame, deep gouges in the wood that looked deliberate, desperate. I ran my fingers along them, feeling how they went deep into the grain, wondering if they'd always been there or if years of tenants had added their own marks. The closet itself was empty except for wire hangers that chimed softly when I opened the door wider, but the back wall looked different, newer than the rest, like someone had put up fresh drywall at some point. The drywall came apart easier than it should have, crumbling under pressure from my car key, revealing a narrow crawl space behind it that shouldn't exist according to the house's layout. The smell hit me first, stale air mixed with something organic, like old leather and mothballs. Using my phone's flashlight, I could see the space extended back about 4 feet, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. There were things in there, boxes and bundles wrapped in deteriorating plastic, all covered in decades of dust. I pulled out the nearest box, my shirt catching on exposed nails, and found it full of someone else's life. Photographs from the 60s, women in beehive hairdos and men in narrow ties, all smiling at backyard barbecues and holiday parties. At the bottom was a driver's license for someone named Gregory Fulton, issued in 1968. The plastic cracked, but the photo still visible. A man with hollow cheeks and deep-set eyes that seemed to follow you no matter which angle you held it. More boxes revealed more pieces of the Fulton's life. Carolyn Fulton's nursing diploma from 1965, their wedding album, tax returns, even a collection of his wristwatch still ticking impossibly after all these years. Everything you'd never leave behind voluntarily. The last box contained something that made me pull my hand back, like I'd touched something hot. A child's dress, yellow with tiny daisies, folded carefully around a pair of small white shoes. Beneath that, Newspaper clippings about the Fultons' disappearance in 1969, how they'd vanished one October night, leaving dinner half-eaten on the table, their car in the driveway, their door unlocked. The articles mentioned search parties, theories about mob connections, mental breakdown, but nothing conclusive. One piece, dated 6 months after they vanished, mentioned how the new owners reported strange incidents. Doors opening by themselves, shadows in the hallways, the feeling of being watched. Those owners lasted 8 months. I sat there on the dusty floor, surrounded by the Fultons' abandoned life, when I heard footsteps on the front porch. Heavy boots, deliberate and slow, followed by a knock that echoed through the empty house. The sheriff stood at the door, a man in his 60s with tired eyes and a badge that had seen better days. He'd heard about someone poking around the old place, wanted to make sure I wasn't a squatter or scavenger. When I explained who I was, showed him my ID, told him about finding the Fultons' belongings, his expression changed from suspicious to something else, something that looked like resignation. He asked me to show him, and when he saw the hidden crawl space, the boxes spread across the bedroom floor, he just nodded like he'd been expecting this call for 40 years. "We knew they never left town," he said quietly, examining Gregory Fulton's license with gloved hands. "But we never found bodies, never found blood, never found anything that would tell us what happened that night." He helped me pull out the rest of the items, taking photos with his phone, making notes in a small notebook he kept pulling from his chest pocket. There were more newspaper clippings at the bottom of the last box, but these were different. Older articles from the 50s about missing persons in Gladwin County, at least 6 cases over 15 years, all from houses near the railroad tracks. The sheriff read them without comment, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he wouldn't say. When we finished cataloging everything, he sat on the porch steps and lit a cigarette, even though I could tell he was trying to quit by the way he held it, guilty and necessary at the same time. "Every single owner after the Fultons left within a year," he said, smoke drifting between us. "Your family lasted 2 years, which was actually the longest. Most made it 6 months, maybe 8. They'd all say different things: electrical problems, job transfers, family issues. But when you pushed them, really pushed them, they'd mention the feelings, the sense that someone was always there, always watching." I asked him about Melody's thin man, half expecting him to laugh or dismiss it like my parents had. But his face went still, cigarette forgotten between his fingers. "Your sister wasn't the only one," he said after a long pause. "Kids from 3 different families described the same thing. A tall, thin figure standing in corners, always in the bedrooms, always at night. One boy, Jamie something, drew pictures of him over and over until his parents found them and burned the whole stack. The thing is, these families didn't know each other, never compared stories, but the descriptions were always identical. Tall, too tall for the ceiling, thin like he hadn't eaten in years, and just standing there, watching." The sheriff dropped his cigarette, crushing it under his boot with more force than necessary. He told me they'd investigated everything, checked for gas leaks that might cause hallucinations, tested for mold, even brought in a psychologist to examine the children. Nothing. No explanation for why multiple kids saw the same impossible figure in the same house across different years. The sheriff stood to leave, brushing dust from his uniform, but stopped at his patrol car and turned back. "There's something else," he said, voice lower now like he was sharing something he shouldn't. "About 10 years ago, we had a homeless man, Vietnam vet, who used to break into empty houses for shelter. One winter night, he broke into this place. We found him the next morning walking down Highway 61 in his underwear, middle of a snowstorm, feet bloody from walking on frozen ground. When we got him to the hospital, all he would say was that there was someone already living in the house, someone in the walls. He kept repeating, 'He's too tall for the rooms, too tall for the doors, but he fits in the spaces between.' The nurses sedated him, and when he woke up, he wouldn't talk about it anymore, just kept shaking whenever anyone mentioned that house. Checked himself out against medical advice and left town that same day. After the sheriff left, I stood alone in that house, the afternoon sun starting to fade, casting everything in that golden light that makes even decay look beautiful for a moment. I thought about calling Melody, asking her what she really remembered, but I knew she wouldn't talk about it. She'd spent years in therapy dealing with what our parents called night terrors, though she insisted until she was 15 that what she saw was real. I started gathering the Fultons' belongings, planning to take them to the sheriff's station, when I noticed something I'd missed before. In one of the photographs from their wedding album, there was a figure in the background standing behind the wedding party. Tall, elongated somehow, like the photo had been stretched in just that spot. It could have been a defect in the old film, a shadow, someone walking past when the shutter clicked. But the more I looked at other photos, the more I found him. At birthday parties, in windows, always at the edges, always slightly distorted like the camera couldn't quite capture what was there. I left everything for the sheriff to collect, walked out of that house and drove straight back to Ohio without stopping except for gas. 2 weeks later, the sheriff called to tell me they'd torn the house down, found nothing unusual in the walls or foundation, no bodies, no evidence of foul play. The Fultons were officially still missing. Case cold. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the demolition crew had complained about the layout being wrong. Rooms that didn't match the blueprint, spaces between walls that shouldn't exist in a house that size. They filled everything in with concrete before leveling it, built a small park where the house used to stand. Sometimes I'd drive past Gladwin on my way to other places, but I never stop. Melody and I don't talk about the house, but once during Christmas dinner last year, she'd had too much wine and said quietly, "He was too tall for the room, wasn't he?" That's what was wrong. He was too tall for any room. We changed the subject immediately, but I knew she still remembered, still saw him sometimes in her dreams, standing in corners that shouldn't exist, waiting in spaces between walls, too tall for any house but somehow always fitting perfectly in the places we don't look. "26 isn't exactly young anymore, but sitting here typing this out, my hands still get clammy remembering what happened when my buddy Jason and I were just 15. We lived in this forgettable town in Iowa, one of those places where the biggest news was usually about someone's dog getting loose or the high school football team losing another game. My parents ran a hardware store downtown, and Jason's dad worked at the grain elevator near the railroad tracks. That summer of 2012, we spent most nights playing video games in my basement, or hanging out at the gas station parking lot with other kids who had nothing better to do. Small town life was boring as hell, which is probably why we decided to sneak out that particular Thursday night in early August. Jason had been texting me all evening about how his older brother told him the park behind Miller Street was where kids went to smoke and drink without getting caught. Neither of us smoked or had access to beer, but the idea of being out past midnight felt rebellious enough for two sheltered kids like us. The park wasn't anything special, just a basketball court with bent rims, some rusty swings, a slide that had been repainted so many times you could peel the layers off like an onion, and a concrete restroom building that always smelled like piss and mildew. We climbed out my bedroom window around 12:30, using the oak tree beside the house that I'd been using as an escape route since I learned about it from a movie. The walk there took maybe 20 minutes through empty streets, past dark houses where everyone was sleeping like normal people do on weeknight. When we got to the park entrance, the first thing we noticed was this old sedan parked near the basketball court, maybe a dark blue or black Ford from the early 2000s. Hard to tell the exact color in the darkness. The engine was running, but the headlights were completely off, which seemed weird even to our teenage brains. We could barely make out someone sitting in the driver's seat, just a shadow really, but definitely a man based on the size and shape. Jason grabbed my arm and whispered something about maybe we should leave, but I was trying to act tough. You know how kids are. So I yelled out, "Hey, everything okay over there?" Real loud. The reaction was immediate and violent. The engine roared. Tires squealed against the asphalt, leaving marks you could still see days later. and the car tore out of there so fast it almost clipped the fence post at the exit. We stood there for a good minute, our hearts pounding, trying to process what just happened. After the adrenaline wore off a bit, we actually laughed about it, making jokes about interrupting someone's drug deal or maybe catching someone cheating on their spouse. We walked over to the basketball court where the car had been parked, and Jason found a cigarette butt still smoldering on the ground, one of those menthol ones with the green ring around the filter. The smart thing would have been to leave right then, but we were 15 and thought we were invincible, so we stayed and headed over to the swings instead. The chains creaked like crazy when we sat down, that metallic groaning sound that echoes in empty spaces at night. We were there maybe 10 minutes talking about stupid stuff like whether Ashley from biology class liked Jason back, when I noticed movement near the restroom building about 30 feet away. The door to the men's room was cracked open maybe 6 inches, and there was someone standing behind it, watching us through the gap. At first I thought maybe it was just another teenager or someone who actually needed to use the bathroom, but then I saw the mask. It was one of those cheap plastic masks they sell at the county fair every year, the kind with the elastic band that always breaks. This one was supposed to be a wolf or maybe a dog, with fake fur glued around the edges that was peeling off in places. The person wearing it wasn't moving at all, just standing there perfectly still, and I could see their eyes through the holes, reflecting a little bit of light from the street lamp across the park. Jason followed my stare and went completely quiet mid-sentence, his whole body tensing up on the swing next to me. We sat there for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds, having this bizarre staring contest with someone in a discount Halloween mask hiding in a public bathroom. Jason was the first to move, standing up slowly from his swing and pulling out his phone to use as a flashlight. The second that beam hit the restroom door, whoever was behind it pulled back into the darkness, and we heard the door slam shut completely. Then nothing, no footsteps running away, no door opening again, just absolute silence, except for our own breathing and the distant sound of a train horn somewhere across town. We argued in harsh whispers about what to do, Jason wanting to run immediately while I insisted we should check if someone needed help. Maybe it was just some homeless person trying to sleep. Finally, we compromised and decided to walk past the restroom on our way out, staying far enough away to run if needed, but close enough to see if the door opened again. As we approached, keeping maybe 15 feet between us and the building, we could hear something that made my skin prickle, breathing, heavy and deliberate, coming from behind that closed door. Not like someone out of breath from running, but more like someone deliberately breathing loud enough for us to hear, almost like they wanted us to know they were still there. Jason had his phone recording video at this point, his hand visibly trembling in the screen's glow, and we speed-walked past without stopping. The moment we cleared the restroom, we heard the door creak open behind us, and both of us just bolted without looking back. We ran harder than I've ever run in my life, cutting through backyards, jumping fences, setting off motion sensor lights all over the neighborhood until we finally made it back to my house, gasping and covered in sweat. We stayed up the rest of the night in my room, doors locked, chairs propped against them like that would somehow help if someone really wanted to get in. Around 5 in the morning, when the sun was starting to come up and we finally felt somewhat safe again, Jason showed me the video he took. Most of it was just shaky darkness and our footsteps, but there was one frame, just one, where you could see the mask more clearly when we passed by. Behind the cheap plastic wolf face, the person was wearing what looked like medical scrubs, the light blue kind, and there was something dark stained on the front that could have been dirt, or could have been something much worse. We debated calling the police, but figured they'd just think we were making stuff up, or get us in trouble for sneaking out, so we kept quiet and agreed to never go back to that park again. The next morning, Friday, my mom was watching the local news while making breakfast when she called me downstairs, her voice all worried and strange. On the TV, there was a reporter standing in front of the same park we'd been at just hours before, yellow police tape everywhere, cops walking around with evidence bags. The reporter was saying something about suspicious items found near the restroom facility and increased patrols in the area, But what really got my attention was when they showed a shot of the basketball court. Right there on the screen, clear as day, were the tire marks from that sedan peeling out, and 2 officers were taking photos of them. My mom asked if I knew anything about it since the park was so close to Jason's house, and I just shrugged and said no, my mouth completely dry. Then my phone started buzzing with texts from Jason. His older brother had driven by the park on his way to work and saw them pulling evidence out of the restroom, including a roll of duct tape, zip ties, and someone's cell phone that had been tossed behind the toilet. What happened next is what still keeps me up some nights, even after all these years. Jason's brother knew a guy who worked dispatch at the police station, and through that connection, we found out something that wasn't on the news. The police had pulled security footage from the gas station across from the park and from 2 different ATM cameras on Miller Street. According to what Jason's brother heard, the footage showed 2 teenage boys, us, entering the park at 12:53 in the morning. But here's the part that makes me want to throw up even now. It also showed that sedan following us from about 2 blocks away, headlights off the entire time, starting from when we first left my house. The driver had been watching us climb out my window, had followed us through the streets, and had gotten to the park just minutes before we did. But that wasn't even the worst part. The footage also showed the person in the mask had been there since 11:30, an hour before we even left my house, just waiting in that restroom. The security cameras caught them arriving in a different car, a white pickup truck with mud covering the license plate, carrying a backpack that they never brought back out. When the police searched more thoroughly, they found that backpack hidden in the ceiling tiles of the restroom. Inside were more zip ties, a knife, a bottle of chloroform that later tested positive for fingerprints from 3 different missing person cases in neighboring states, and a notebook with dates and locations, including my address and Jason's address circled multiple times. The person in the mask and the driver of the sedan were working together, and according to the timestamps on the footage, they had been communicating by text the whole time we were there, coordinating their positions around the park. The police never caught them. Both vehicles turned out to be stolen, taken from a used car lot 2 towns over earlier that week. The DNA evidence from the cigarette butt and the items in the backpack didn't match anything in the system. Jason and I had to give statements to the police, and our parents were obviously furious about us sneaking out. But that anger quickly turned to relief and then terror when they realized how close we'd come to something unimaginable. We found out later that there had been similar reports from 3 other towns within a 50-mile radius that summer. 2 teenagers or young people alone at night, suspicious vehicles, someone in a cheap mask, and abandoned items suggesting an attempted abduction. In one case from June, a girl actually went missing for 6 hours before managing to escape from a basement when her captors left to get food. She described 2 men, one tall and thin, one shorter and heavy, but trauma had affected her memory, and she couldn't give enough detail for a sketch. After our incident, the pattern stopped completely, like they knew the heat was on and just vanished. To this day, I triple-check my locks. I never go to parks at night, and whenever I see those cheap plastic masks at stores, I have to leave immediately. Jason moved away for college and never came back to town. We don't talk about that night anymore, but I know he thinks about it too. Especially when the news shows another story about someone who wasn't as lucky as we were. The security monitors in Building B showed nothing but empty hallways and loading docks, just like every other night since I'd started this maintenance supervisor gig 3 weeks ago. Outside, October wind rattled the metal siding of the industrial complex. 5 concrete giants that squatted on the old entrance to the St. Alder coal mine like tombstones, marking where the town's prosperity had died. My thermos of coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I kept sipping it anyway while reviewing the checklist for tonight's rounds. Replace the ballast in the warehouse's south corner, check the leak in Building D's roof, test the emergency exits in the plastics factory. Simple stuff that kept me from thinking too much about why I was back in Ridgemont after swearing I'd never set foot in Pennsylvania again. The divorce had been finalized last month. Baltimore felt like a different lifetime, and here I was, 34, and starting over in the same place I'd started from. By midnight, I'd already handled the urgent repairs and was doing my second walkthrough of Building C when I heard it for the first time. A rhythmic clanging, metal on metal, coming from somewhere beneath the concrete floor. The sound lasted maybe 10 seconds before stopping, faint enough that I almost convinced myself it was just the old heating pipes expanding and contracting with the temperature changes. These buildings were constructed in the 70s, all of them rushing to cover the mine entrance after what happened in 1952. So weird noises were part of the package. I made a note in my log about checking the basement mechanical room tomorrow night and continued my rounds, but the sound stuck with me. There was something deliberate about the rhythm. 3 quick strikes, then a pause, then 3 more, like someone signaling rather than random pipe noise. Still, I'd learned not to let my imagination run wild during these long nights alone. That was a quick way to make yourself paranoid in empty buildings, where every shadow seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at it. The following week, the sounds became impossible to ignore. They started around 11 each night, always the same pattern but from different spots beneath Building C's floor, as if whatever was making them was moving through some kind of tunnel system below. I'd checked the basement 3 times already, crawling through the mechanical room with my flashlight, inspecting every pipe joint and valve, but found nothing out of place. The building's original blueprints, which I'd dug out of a filing cabinet in the main office, showed only a standard basement layout. No sub-basements, no access tunnels, nothing that would explain the sounds that were now accompanied by what I could only describe as muffled voices, too distorted to make out words, but definitely human in cadence. When I mentioned it casually to Tony, the day shift supervisor who'd been working the complex for 15 years, he just shrugged and said the place had always been noisy, especially Building C. Something about the way the wind hit it just right. What really got under my skin wasn't the sounds themselves, but the fact that they followed a schedule. Every night at 11, continuing until around 2 in the morning, then complete silence. I started bringing a digital recorder, trying to capture evidence that I wasn't losing my mind, but the playback only picked up faint static and the hum of the ventilation system. On Wednesday night, I decided to stay in Building C's basement during the active hours, sitting on an overturned bucket next to the boiler, with every light on and my phone recording video. At exactly 11, the clanging started, so close I could feel the vibrations through my boots, but this time I noticed something else. A draft of cold air that shouldn't exist in a sealed basement, coming from behind a section of wall covered by a massive industrial shelf unit loaded with old paint cans and cleaning supplies. The shelf must have weighed 800 pounds, but I could see gaps in the dust pattern on the floor, drag marks barely visible, like someone had moved it recently and tried to put it back exactly where it had been. It took me 3 nights to work up the courage and find the right equipment to move that shelf. I borrowed a furniture dolly from the loading dock and waited until Friday, when I knew the weekend security guard, Frank, would be doing his rounds at the other end of the complex. Inch by inch, I leveraged the shelf away from the wall, paint cans rattling with each pull, until I exposed what was hidden behind it. A freight elevator door, painted the same industrial beige as the walls, but with the unmistakable outline of the sliding gates. The manufacturer's plate was still visible, barely. Westinghouse freight elevator, Model F4, installed 1951. According to every blueprint and planning document I'd found, this elevator didn't exist. The control panel was dead, no power running to it, but the manual release lever on the gate still worked. And when I pulled it, the doors scraped open to reveal a shaft that descended into absolute darkness. The air that rushed up smelled wrong, not just stale or moldy, but sharp with something chemical that made my throat burn. The smart thing would have been to close those doors, push the shelf back, and pretend I'd never found it. Instead, I went back to my office and grabbed every flashlight I could find, plus the 100-foot rope from the emergency kit. The elevator car itself was stuck about 20 feet down the shaft, its roof accessible by a maintenance ladder bolted to the wall. When I climbed down and dropped onto the car's roof, my flashlight beam caught something that made me stop breathing for a second. The hatch was already open, and inside the car were hard hats, at least a dozen of them, arranged in a perfect circle on the floor. Each helmet had a carbide lamp attached, the old kind miners used before battery-powered lights, and in the center of the circle sat a leather-bound logbook, its pages swollen with moisture but still readable. The first entry was dated May 15, 1952, just 2 days before the mine supposedly collapsed, and it was written in pencil. Foreman Briggs ordered us to stay. Says the company will make it right. We can hear them drilling the seal already. I sat there in that elevator car for what felt like hours, reading through the logbook by flashlight, each entry more horrifying than the last. May 16th. 23 of us down here. Briggs says the benzene leak from the new chemical plant topside is worse than they thought. Company can't afford the cleanup if the state finds out. Cheaper to seal us in and claim cave-in. May the 17th. They cut the phone lines. Eddie tried to climb the shaft, but they'd already started pouring concrete at level 2. We can hear it setting above us. May the 18th. Air's getting thin. Briggs distributed the remaining water, says we need to make it look real for when they eventually dig us out. Some of the men are talking about using the dynamite we have left. The entries became shorter, more desperate. May 20th. 16 still breathing. Decided to try the old shaft on the east side. If you find this, know that Allegheny Chemical Corporation murdered us. The final entry was different, written in shaky handwriting. May 22nd, I'm the last one. The others went deeper, looking for the ventilation shaft that connects to Baker's farm. I stayed because someone needs to witness this. The benzene is pooling at level 3. They'll build right on top of us and no one will ever know. My name is Joseph Garrett. I have a wife named Ruth and 2 boys. Tell them I tried to come home. Below that, in different ink that looked much fresher, someone had written a single line, "We're still here." The temperature in the elevator suddenly dropped so fast I could see my breath, and from somewhere far below came that familiar clanging sound, except now I understood what it was. Mining tools on rock, the sound of men still trying to dig their way out. That's when the elevator car lurched just a few inches, but enough to make me scramble for the ladder. The cables above groaned like they were supporting weight they hadn't held in decades, and I could hear something else now. Something that sounded impossibly like footsteps on the rungs below me, climbing up from the depths of the shaft. I've never climbed anything so fast in my life. My flashlight bounced wildly as I hauled myself up those rungs, not daring to look down, the sound of those footsteps getting closer with each second. When I reached the basement floor, I grabbed the logbook and 2 of the helmets without thinking, then slammed the elevator gates shut and engaged the manual lock. The clanging from below became frantic, like dozens of pickaxes striking metal simultaneously, and the whole building seemed to vibrate with the force of it. I dragged that shelf back into place using strength I didn't know I had, my mind racing with the implications of what I'd found. 23 men, sealed underground with toxic chemicals, erased from history and replaced with a story about a mining accident. The next morning, I drove straight to the county records office and spent 6 hours searching through death certificates from 1952. There was no Joseph Garrett, no mining accident in May. The St. Alder mine officially closed in March of 1952 for economic reasons, 2 months before those logbook entries were written. I tried calling the State Environmental Agency, the Historical Society, even a journalist friend in Philadelphia, but every conversation ended the same way. They needed proof beyond an old logbook, something concrete that couldn't be dismissed as a hoax. So I went back the next night, armed with a crowbar and my phone to take pictures of everything. But when I moved the shelf again, the elevator doors opened to solid concrete. Not old concrete either. This was fresh, maybe a day old at most, still slightly damp to the touch. Someone had filled the entire shaft while I was gone, working fast enough to complete it in less than 24 hours. The only evidence I had left was the logbook and those 2 helmets I'd grabbed, but when I got back to my office, they were gone from my desk. In their place was a typed note. "Your employment has been terminated effective immediately. Your final check will be mailed. Do not return to the property." It was unsigned, but underneath someone had written in pencil, "Some things need to stay buried." The check arrived a week later, 3 times what they owed me, along with a non-disclosure agreement and a letter from a law firm I'd never heard of, stating that any discussion of alleged historical incidents related to the industrial complex would result in legal action. I didn't sign it. Instead, I spent the next month researching Allegheny Chemical Corporation, which had merged with 2 other companies in the 60s and eventually became part of a multinational conglomerate that still operated facilities across Pennsylvania. Every thread I pulled led to sealed records, lost documents, or people who suddenly didn't want to talk after making a few phone calls. An old-timer at the library, who'd worked in the mines as a young man, pulled me aside one afternoon and told me that everyone knew something had happened at St. Alder, but the families had been paid off or threatened into silence, and those who'd tried to speak up over the years had a tendency to have accidents or simply leave town without warning. I live in Montana now, working construction, trying to put distance between myself and whatever I stirred up that night in Building C. But sometimes, usually around 11 at night, I think about those 23 men and wonder if they're still down there, still digging, still hoping someone will hear them. Last month, I got an email from a blocked address with a single attachment, a newspaper clipping from 1952, about a benzene leak at a chemical plant in Pennsylvania that killed 3 workers and contaminated the groundwater. The article mentions an emergency cleanup supervised by Allegheny Chemical Corporation and notes that the incident was fully resolved with no lasting environmental impact. But there's a detail that wasn't in any of my research. The plant was built directly over the sealed St. Alder mine, using the old shaft as a waste disposal system. The email had no text, just the article and a photo taken recently, showing Building C of the industrial complex. In the basement window, barely visible, someone had traced words in what looked like coal dust. "Still here." I deleted the email, changed my phone number, and stopped looking back. Some truths aren't meant to surface, and some voices, no matter how desperate, are better left unheard. Arizona in July feels like standing inside an oven, and visiting my cousin Brett during peak summer wasn't my brightest idea. College in California had just wrapped up for me, and instead of heading home to surf and sleep, I drove 12 hours through the desert to spend a week with him. Brett had been doing ranger work for a couple years, out in this desolate stretch near the Superstition Mountains, living in a cabin that felt more like an outpost on Mars than anywhere in America. Just turned 21 that spring, and here I was sweating through my shirt before noon, wondering why Brett chose this life over literally any other job. His place sat 3 miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by nothing but scorched earth, towering saguaros, and these massive red rock formations that looked older than time itself. When I pulled up that Sunday afternoon, Brett came out to greet me, but something was different about him. He kept his eyes moving constantly, checking the ridgeline, the wash behind his cabin, even glancing at the sky like he expected something to drop from it. We sat on his porch that first evening, drinking lukewarm beer while the coyotes started their nightly chorus, and he barely said 10 words. Monday afternoon, Brett finally loosened up enough to suggest showing me around his territory. Around 4 o'clock, when the sun had shifted enough to create some shade in the canyons, he mentioned Trail 14, said it was one of the quieter routes that most tourists never found, winding through a narrow canyon to reach some abandoned mining equipment from way back. The trailhead sat right behind his cabin, just a wooden post with a carved number 14 that looked ready to fall over. Brett loaded his pack with more gear than seemed necessary for a short hike: extra water, first aid kit, his radio, and his service weapon, which he checked twice before holstering. The path started easy enough, cutting between tall stands of Palo Verde trees, before descending into the canyon proper. After about 40 minutes of hiking, the walls rose up around us, red stone towering maybe 60 feet overhead, and the temperature dropped enough that I stopped sweating for the first time all day. Brett led us toward what he called Skeleton Creek, explaining it hadn't seen water in almost a decade. We rounded a bend where the creek bed widened into a flat area scattered with white stones, and that's when we both stopped dead. Right in the middle of the wash was a javelina, its body parts arranged in a perfect spiral pattern, each piece placed with the kind of care that made bile rise in my throat. Brett pulled out his radio immediately but hesitated before calling it in. He walked around the carcass in a wide circle, taking photos with his phone, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles working. The spiral was maybe 6 feet across, with the head placed dead center, eyes somehow still intact and staring straight up at the narrow strip of sky between the canyon walls. Each leg had been separated at the joint and positioned to create the spiral arms, with smaller pieces filling in the gaps. No blood pool underneath, which meant it had been killed somewhere else and brought here. Brett muttered something about this being the third one this month, then told me to step back while he documented everything. The smell hit me then, not just death, but something chemical underneath it, like formaldehyde mixed with sage. Brett noticed it too, covering his nose with his sleeve while he worked. He pointed to the ground around the spiral where someone had swept the sand smooth, erasing any footprints except for our own. We kept hiking after Brett called it in to the main station, though neither of us talked much. Another 20 minutes up the trail, we found the second one. A coyote this time, arranged in a perfect triangle near a cluster of barrel cacti. Then a rattlesnake about 10 minutes later, its body parts forming a pentagon on a flat rock that jutted out from the canyon wall. Each arrangement was different but equally precise, like someone had used a measuring tape and protractor to get the angles right. Brett's radio crackled with responses from the station, but the static was so bad in the canyon that we could barely make out what they were saying. The sun was getting low, painting the canyon walls this deep orange color that would have been beautiful if we weren't finding mutilated animals every few hundred yards. By the time we reached the old mining site at the trail's end, we'd counted 7 different arrangements, each one more elaborate than the last. The final one made us both stop breathing for a second. A desert bighorn sheep, massive thing that must have weighed 200 pounds. Its parts arranged in a complex pattern that looked almost like a star chart or constellation map. Brett took more photos while I tried not to vomit, the combination of heat and that chemical smell making my head spin. He showed me something I hadn't noticed at first. Small symbols carved into the rocks near each arrangement. These weird interconnected circles with lines radiating outward. Some had been filled in with what looked like charcoal or ash, making them stand out against the red stone. The mining site itself was just rusted equipment and a collapsed shaft entrance, but Brett found more symbols carved into the wooden beams that still stood. He traced one with his finger, then jerked his hand back like it had shocked him. When I asked what was wrong, he just shook his head and said we needed to leave before dark. The hike back felt twice as long, with shadows stretching across the trail and every sound making us both jump. Brett kept checking behind us, his hand hovering near his weapon, and I caught myself doing the same thing even though I had no idea what we were watching for. We passed the arrangements again, and in the dying light, they looked different somehow. More deliberate, like they were pointing towards something or marking a path we couldn't see. We made it back to Brett's cabin just as full dark hit, and he immediately locked both doors and checked all the windows, something I'd never seen him do the night before. He poured us each 3 fingers of whiskey, his hands not quite steady, and finally started talking about the other incidents. First one had been a month ago, just a single rabbit arranged in a perfect square near Trail 7. Then 2 weeks later, 3 arrangements on Trail 10. Last week, 5 on Trail 3. Always increasing, always more complex, and always on trails that led deeper into the canyon system. The local sheriff's department had been out twice but found nothing except the carcasses, no tracks or evidence of who might be doing it. Brett had his own theory, though. He'd noticed someone had been camping illegally somewhere in the park, finding traces of fire pits that had been carefully covered, makeshift shelters that had been torn down, and footprints in places where no hiker should be. Whoever it was knew the area well, maybe better than the rangers did, and they were getting bolder with each passing week. Around midnight, we were both still awake, Brett cleaning his rifle at the kitchen table while I pretended to read a book, but really just stared at the same page. That's when we heard it. Footsteps on the gravel outside, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. Brett held up his hand for me to stay quiet, then moved to the window, keeping to the side so he couldn't be seen from outside. The footsteps continued, sometimes stopping right outside a window for 30 seconds or more before moving on. Then came this sound I'll never forget. Fingernails or something sharp dragging across the wooden walls, starting at the front door and moving all the way around to the back. Brett had his rifle ready, but when he finally looked outside with a flashlight, nobody was there. Just our two vehicles parked where we'd left them, and the endless darkness of the desert beyond. The smell hit us when Brett cracked open the back door to check the porch. That same chemical stench from the canyon mixed with fresh-turned earth, and something else, something organic and wrong. There were no footprints in the dirt, which made no sense given how clearly we'd heard someone walking on the gravel. Brett called it in to dispatch, but they said all units were tied up with some emergency in town and couldn't send anyone until morning. We spent the rest of the night taking shifts, one of us always awake and watching while the other tried to sleep on the couch. Every hour or so we'd hear something, a branch snapping too close to the cabin, what sounded like whispered voices from somewhere in the darkness, or that dragging sound against the walls again. Around 3 in the morning, I was on watch when I saw something that made every hair on my body stand up. Through the kitchen window, barely visible in the moonlight, someone was standing at the edge of the clearing where the desert began. They weren't moving, just standing there facing the cabin, too far away to make out any features, but close enough that I knew they were watching us. I grabbed Brett, but by the time he got to the window, whoever it was had vanished. We found something in the morning, though, a patch of disturbed earth about 50 feet from the cabin where someone had been digging. The hole maybe 3 feet deep and perfectly rectangular, with that same awful smell rising from it. Sheriff's Department finally showed up around 9 that morning, 2 deputies who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Brett led them to the hole first, and I watched their expressions change from bored to concerned when they saw how precise the edges were, like someone had used a framing square to get perfect 90-degree angles. One deputy took photos while the other walked the perimeter, finding more disturbed areas we'd missed in our exhaustion. Smaller holes arranged in a pattern that formed a half circle around the back of the cabin. They called for backup and a forensic team, suddenly taking everything very seriously. While we waited, Brett showed them photos from the trail, and one of the deputies recognized the symbols carved in the rocks. Said they'd found similar markings at an abandoned homestead about 15 miles north, where some squatters had been living illegally for months before disappearing 2 weeks ago. The forensic team arrived in the afternoon with metal detectors and excavation equipment, and what they found in those holes changed everything. Animal bones, hundreds of them, sorted by type and wrapped in cloth that reeked of that chemical smell. But underneath those, they found notebooks wrapped in plastic, pages filled with detailed observations about every ranger in the park, their schedules, their routes, even personal details like what they ate for lunch. My name was in there too, written just days before I'd arrived, with a note that said, "Visitor coming young male, relationship to Ranger Howell unknown, surveillance priority high." Brett went pale reading that, realizing someone had been watching him long enough to know I was coming before he'd told anyone at work. The notebooks contained maps of every trail in the park, marked with times and dates of ranger patrols, hiker traffic patterns, and these strange symbols at specific locations. One map showed Trail 14 with 7 marks, exactly where we'd found the animal arrangements. But there were marks on other trails too, dozens of them, some with dates listed for the coming weeks. The detective in charge, a woman named Rodriguez who'd driven down from Phoenix, said it looked like someone was documenting the park for something bigger, maybe planning something they hadn't carried out yet. She had Brett and the other rangers evacuate all the remote cabins that night, moving everyone to the main ranger station in town. They found the camp the next morning, hidden in a box canyon that wasn't on any official trail maps. 3 military-style tents, supplies for months, and more notebooks filled with observations going back 2 years. What really got to everyone was the final notebook they recovered, the one that had been left open on a makeshift desk, made from stacked rocks and a piece of plywood. The handwriting was different from the others, more frantic and deteriorating as the pages went on, like someone writing while losing their grip on reality. It documented the daily movements of every ranger down to the minute, but toward the end, the entries became stranger. References to the pattern being complete, the land demanding its tribute, and detailed descriptions of rituals that needed to be performed at specific coordinates. The last entry, written just 2 days before we found those arrangements on Trail 14, was the worst. It described Brett and me by name, said we would walk the trail as planned, that we would find what had been prepared, and then just one line at the bottom. They walked the trail every night. Below that, nothing but coordinates, hundreds of them, covering 3 pages, each one corresponding to a location in the park. Detective Rodriguez had a team check the first few coordinates and found more animal arrangements at each one, some fresh, others weeks old, all arranged in those same geometric patterns. They never found whoever had been living in that camp. The forensic team determined at least 3 different people had been there based on DNA evidence, but none matched anyone in the system. The only lead came from a gas station security camera in town that caught 3 figures in dark clothing buying supplies 6 weeks earlier, their faces carefully turned away from the camera, moving in this synchronized way that made my skin prickle just watching the footage. Brett took leave after that, couldn't handle going back to the cabin knowing someone had been watching him for years. I cut my visit short, drove straight back to California without stopping except for gas. The Park Service closed that section for 6 months, said it was for maintenance and ecological survey, but Brett told me they brought in federal investigators and found more camps, more arrangements, more evidence of long-term surveillance of isolated government facilities across 3 states. I still have nightmares about that figure standing at the edge of the clearing, and sometimes I wake up certain I can smell that chemical stench, that mix of death and earth and something else. Brett's working in Colorado now, an office job with the Forest Service. Says he's done with remote assignments. He sent me a news article last month about hikers finding animal arrangements in the Rockies. Same geometric patterns, same symbols carved in the rocks. The article didn't mention the notebooks they found, but Brett heard through his contacts. Same handwriting, same detailed surveillance, and at the bottom of the last page, those same 5 words that keep me awake some nights. They walk the trail every night,